Today we're going to be unpacking and looking at how we can interact with students in a way that helps them to develop their thinking. Welcome to our third episode of the Schools Template discussion. When I first joined Pais, I joined fresh out of high school, so I was 18 and I started in a team. I was from Manchester and we were based in Manchester, but we travelled around all of the UK, and I honestly wrote our lessons and we packed them as full as possible of loads of content and loads of different sections so they would be really fast paced and they would move really quickly. Honestly, maybe a little bit too quickly. We kind of blew into classrooms a little bit like a Texas tornado. The problem was that I was scared. I was actually terrified of something, and that was why I packed our classes so full of content. As a young 18-year-old, I was absolutely terrified of questions. Questions made me nervous because I was scared that I might not have the answers to questions. They also made me nervous because I had this perspective that viewed them as a failure in my communication, that if people asked questions, it was because I hadn't explained myself well enough. And so I was scared, and so I stuffed lessons so full of action that there was no time for questions. And I would get to the end of a class, and if there was no questions, I would feel like I'd done my job properly. But the reality was that actually students didn't have the opportunity to interact and engage in a way that developed their thinking. I just taught them what they were supposed to think. And so today we're going to unpack a little bit about how we can use questions to help develop students' thinking and how we can actually embrace and lean into questions. When we look at the Gospels, we notice that Jesus embraced questions wherever he went. In Luke 12:41-43, Peter asked, "Lord, are you telling this parable to us or to everyone?" And the Lord answered, "Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give him their food allowance at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns." And so Jesus has just told a whole load of parables, and Peter's asking a question, but Jesus replies with another question. And so we've noticed this pattern where Jesus not only embraces questions, but Jesus uses questions. And so we're going to unpack a little bit about how we can do what Jesus did. So how do we embrace questions, and how do we lean into them, and how do we do what Jesus did in that context? Well, I intentionally grew myself, and so I tried to grow my foundation, my depth of knowledge, because questions made me nervous, because I didn't feel confident that I had the answers, and I put enormous pressure on myself to be an expert when it came to things of Christianity and teaching content in schools. So I intentionally grew myself, and Havrim was a great way to do that, to grow my biblical understanding and theological perspectives. Also, wider reading was really helpful to stretch my thinking. Reading different people's perspectives and different people's thoughts and different people's conversations around theological and sociological topics helped stretch and give me a depth of knowledge that I could draw on. And I felt confident when I was asked questions that I could draw from that foundation. Rethinking and thinking about our perspective on communication helps us understand what we're trying to accomplish. And so, for example, if I believe that I've got to communicate everything that a student could possibly need to know about a topic in a class, then that puts enormous pressure on ourselves to try and cram too much into a classroom. The reality is, of course, in the space of 45 minutes or 50 minutes, it's impossible to communicate absolutely everything about a topic. And so I began to change my mind, and I began to think about it as an opportunity to start the ball rolling and a young person going on a adventure to explore a subject and explore a topic, rather than trying to give them absolutely everything they need to know. So I wanted to teach them how to think rather than simply what to think. And when we begin to think about communication from that perspective, it helps us think about what is the end goal that we're trying to achieve in this class, and how do we accomplish that? How do we take students on a journey where they learn how to think, not simply what to think? So as I said before, Jesus seemed to embrace and lean into questions. So let's look at that a little bit more, and let's look at what Jesus did. Jesus intentionally invited questions. He invited them through parables, and he used hyperlinks to wider passages of scripture all the time to draw out questions from the disciples or whoever was listening. He was intentionally a little bit ambiguous with the object lessons and the ways that he communicated, and I believe it was so that he would kind of get conversation going, that the disciples would lean in and they would ask him more questions, and he could draw out their understanding. And Jesus used questions all the time. In fact, he often answered people's questions with questions. I don't know if you've ever asked, how many questions did Jesus ask? Theologians track through the Gospels the number of questions that they noticed that Jesus was asked were around about 183 questions. And guess how many answers Jesus gave that were just direct answers? Only 3. Jesus asked around about 307 questions. Oftentimes they were questions that he asked after he was asked a question. So for example, in Mark 4, we see the disciples asking Jesus further questions about the parables. And Mark 4 verse 10 says this. It says, when he was alone, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. And we notice from a lot of the interaction that Jesus has that he's looking to develop the disciples and his listeners' understanding rather than simply teaching them what they were supposed to believe. Let me share an illustration with you that if you've been part of maybe one of Paul's masterclasses or read some of his books, you may be familiar with. But let me show you with this illustration how effective questions can be to drawing out people's understanding. The story goes, a lady walked into an art gallery in Israel, and she began to browse the pictures. She narrowed it down to a handful of those paintings that she liked best, and wanting to buy one and take one home, she was kind of stuck in a little bit of a dilemma, trying to figure out which that she liked best. Noticing her, the artist walked over and began to kind of start a conversation with her, and seeing that she was stuck in a little bit of a dilemma, he asked if there was a way that he could help. And she said to him, well, I like this handful of paintings of yours, but I don't know which to choose and take home. Which one is your favorite? Looking at her, the artist replied, are you married? She thought, that's a little bit of an odd question, but she answered anyway. She said yes. And his next question was, do you have any children? And she thought, well, he's getting a little personal here, but she rolled with it and she said yes. And at that point he said, well, which of your children is your favorite? And as he asked that question, she began to realize where he was going with these questions. And she began to realize that the artist couldn't choose a favorite painting because, like she couldn't choose which one of her children were her favorite, all of his pictures and all of his paintings were special to him in different ways. And his questions drew out a level of understanding that she may not have got to if he'd simply replied with I can't choose a favorite, or I don't have a favorite. He could have replied with a direct answer, but his questions led her to a deeper level of understanding. So this can be a really effective technique, and method that we can use to help students develop a deeper level of understanding. I want to use another illustration just to help us think through how we use this to grow and to help a student's level of understanding. So let's imagine the ends of this rope are point A and point B, and point A represents the initial question and point B represents the understanding that we want students to get to. And in between point A and B there's 3 knots, and these 3 knots represent 3 questions. It's advisable to use just about 3 questions to help get students from A to B. Much more than 3 questions gets a little bit long and convoluted, but 3 questions can be really helpful to be a short, kind of concise and brief answers. So we're going from point A to point B using these 3 questions. For example, one of the questions that I was recently asked by some students was, why doesn't Jesus answer all of our prayers straight away? And it was a little bit of a hard question. It was something that they were wrestling with personally. And so there was a little bit of an emotive kind of dimension to that question. But I wanted to get students from point A to point B in their understanding, and I wanted to use 3 questions to do that. So first of my questions was, have you ever bought a friend a birthday present or a Christmas present? And the students looked at me and they were like, yeah, we have. I said, okay, and have any of your friends ever come to your house before their birthday or before Christmas, and what did you do with their present? And they said, oh, well, we put it away, we hid it. Well, did you hide it for them or did you hide it from them? I wanted to help my students understand that when Jesus may not always answer our questions right away, that oftentimes he hides things for us, not from us. He's not withholding things, but he's hiding things until the moment is right, until the right time. You know, just as we might hide a present for our friend, for their birthday, for Christmas, that they might enjoy it in due time. That is an example of how we can get from point A to point B, and this kind of knot process has helped me kind of with a physical example as I was learning to kind of use this question technique and methodology, think through how do I get from point A to point B and how do I use 3 questions to do it. So as we bring this episode to a close, I want to talk about fishhooks. If you remember in my previous episode, we talked about using fishhooks to invite conversation and bait questions. Well, fishhooks can be really helpful. We see Jesus do this all the time with his parables and object lessons and different questions that he asked of his audience. And fishhooks can be a really helpful moment to invite conversation and to get the ball rolling with questions being asked of us that draw out understanding. So when we use fishhooks, it's really important that we create a sense of tension around them, a sense of drama, and we can do that through our body language, through our tone of voice, but we can also do it by creating a bit of a pause, just taking a moment to breathe, allowing the fishhook to sink in. So for example, if you remember in the previous episode, one of the fishhooks that we talked about was when we talk about a story from the Bible, we don't always have to directly reference it, but we might talk about it in the context of a wise story from a book that we often read. And we create a little bit of tension, not only through the tone of voice and maybe our body language, but by just taking a moment to pause, to let the fishhook sink in and move into whatever the fishhook is going to be. It's also really important to invite questions. So at the end of a section where we've just maybe started with a fishhook, or we've had a fishhook somewhere in the middle of one of our modules, it's really helpful to take a moment and ask students, hey, do you have any questions? Oftentimes I like to break into small groups and invite questions in those kind of contexts as well. But it's really important to create space for questions, and you can do that in a variety of creative ways, or as simple as just asking students, would you like to ask us any questions? So that brings this episode to a close, and in the next episode we're going to be talking about dynamics and how we can use dynamics within a classroom setting to engage students more and to switch their curiosity on to the gospel.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. In the description below there is a free workshop guide for this episode, and while you're here, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel.